Today we begin a new message series called Seriously God? Making sense of life, not making sense. My dear sisters and brothers, there are times in life when we look to the heavens and say, Seriously God? Because life doesn't make sense. And so we conclude, God doesn't make sense. I don't deny the fact that life can get very difficult. It keeps throwing curveballs at us constantly, non-stop. Whether it be our personal health or relationship issue, job opportunity, or a misunderstanding, or loss of a loved one, or loss of a marriage, we are often tempted to say, Seriously, God? I've been so good. Life doesn't make sense, nor do you seem to make sense. My sister and brother, I found myself in a difficult situation 34 years ago. I was with a family that had their only son, Matthew, a boy of 12, killed in a road accident, hit and run case, drunken driving. And the boy would serve Mass every day. And that day he served Mass and was just going back to his house when the child was killed. A new priest that I was, inexperienced, I turned to the father and said, Joe, God is your father and he loves you. And he said, Seriously? God is a loving father? Where was he? And so, my sister and brother, oftentimes, life doesn't make sense. And so, God doesn't seem to make sense. Let's see how we approach God and try to learn His ways. A little fable comes to my mind. I was in the 4th grade and this was my lesson, this whole fable. The encounter of 4 men, blind men, with an elephant. As they were led to the elephant, and in India we have them domesticated, a good number of them. The first blind man passed his hand over the side of the elephant and jumped up and said, Oh, I know, an elephant is like a massive wall. The second blind man bent down, put his arms around the legs, and said, I know what an elephant is. It's like a pillar, a strong, sturdy column. And the third man, who was led to the back of the elephant, felt the tail and said, You guys are wrong. The elephant feels like a rope. And the last blind man felt the trunk of the elephant and said, You guys don't know what you're talking about. An elephant feels like a massive hose pipe. My sister and brother, they were not wrong, but they were not fully right. You and I are that blind persons. And God is that elephant that we are trying to get our minds and hearts wrapped around. We can only know so much of God with our small brain. And that is why the first point I want to say to you is, God not making sense makes sense. How can you understand God? How can you comprehend His ways? How can you go to the depths of His knowing? No way. And that is why Isaiah would say, God's ways are not our ways. In fact, God would say, my ways are not your ways. My thoughts are not your thoughts. For as the sky is distant from the earth, so are my thoughts and ways distant from yours. God, not making sense, makes sense. The second point. When God makes sense, we better get to know Him and love Him and follow Him. Now, go back to that fable I studied in the 4th grade, the blind man and the elephant. What if the elephant were to talk, to describe itself, to give a profile of who it is? I am a massive mammal that walks the face of the earth. I have a big body that weighs heavily, and so my legs are actually like pillars, but flexible and soft. And with my trunk, I'm able to feed myself, quench my thirst. I can even ward off the enemy. Now, come to our elephant, God, talking to us, the blind man. God is constantly communicating. He is all the time talking to us, always revealing, unveiling, and making known through the prophets. We see it in the scriptures. And in the fullness of time, through His Son. God making sense so that He could reveal Himself to us, so that we could know Him and love Him. And what did Jesus do? He revealed to God in the best possible way we can understand. And He said, look, I come from God. I am of God. I am the Son of God. And all the others that you try to learn from are blind guides. They have not seen God. They are blind. And if you want to be led by them, you will be blind, being led by the blind. Both of you will fall into the pit. And so let's look to Jesus. He went through a lot of trials and tribulations. And when He was betrayed, when He was flogged, when He was forced to carry the cross, and when He was nailed to the cross, did He say, seriously, Father? Is this how you treat your son? My sister and brother, God not making sense makes sense. When God begins to make sense, we better begin to know Him and love Him and follow Him. It means we read the scriptures, we sit in prayer, we listen to homilies, we go for spiritual direction, we talk to the elders in the family and in the church, or we read the lives of saints. And the third point that I want to share with you is, this is important. There is a difference between life not making sense and God not making sense. And you better don't mix up the two. Oftentimes, life doesn't make sense. Look at yourself. You've been so very healthy, had a healthy way of life, never smoked a cigarette, never had a shot of whiskey, and yet you have been diagnosed with lung cancer. Life doesn't make sense. You've been a daily communicant, saying your morning and evening prayers, pitching in and making your offering, generous with your time. And there you lose a loved one. And you are tempted to say, seriously, God? Life doesn't make sense. True, life doesn't make sense. But to conclude, God doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Look at our world today. So much of problems, So much of corruption, injustice, exploitation, people being treated unfairly. Look at the priests, the politicians, and the pundits who are at the leadership. And you might be tempted to say, God, these are the people you entrust with the work of governance? Seriously, God? It doesn't make sense. How do we understand it? You know, God has blessed us all with a free will. And God respects our free will. When I want to go this way, God would try to tell me. He would get my attention and say, son, that's not the way, go this way. And if I choose to go down that path, God doesn't put a block. He doesn't come and say, stop, go back. God respects my free will. And that is why we need to distinguish between God's preferred will and God's permissible will. By preferred will, what I mean is, as God would have His way, things as God would want them done. That happens in heaven, and that's why we call it heaven. God's preferred will is done there perfectly, to the letter. But on earth, we all have our choices to make, our decisions to go with, and God permits it, permissible will. And that is why there is so much of pain and persecution, evil and wickedness, corruption and injustice. And that is why life doesn't make sense, and we don't conclude that God doesn't make sense. To conclude, God not making sense does make sense because He is God. And our minds are only so big. We can only take on, understand so much. 2, when God begins to make sense, that is when we should attempt to know Him, love Him, and follow Him. And finally, we need to remember always, especially for a rainy day, when life overwhelms us, when we least expect, that there is a difference between life not making sense and God not making sense. And don't you ever mix up. Because God always makes sense. It's my prayer, my wish, and blessing for you and for myself that all of us will always remember how to make sense of God when God doesn't make sense. And more especially, that there is a difference between life not making sense and God not making sense. So join a small faith group. You get a copy of the Seriously God book, and you can deepen your faith. You can also deepen the faith of one another. All the members of the staff and all the leaders in the pastoral council, as well as the clergy, are part of this small faith groups. So why can't you? Sign up after the Mass if you have not done so.